Hello, everyone, and welcome to Daviji's podcast, a space where we share real stories of growth, setback, leadership, and learning. Of course, to support your personal, professional, and entrepreneurial journey beyond the university. Today, I'm joined by Ebrahim Matthews, the Senior Vice President of International Higher Education at Pearson and an independent governor at the University of Derby. Ibrahim has worked across financial services, product leadership, and global education, holding senior leadership roles at Pearson, Standard Bank, MasterCard, and Dinas Club Africa. His work has focused on turnarounds, growth, strategy, and building high performing multicultural teams, all while navigating major shifts in how the world learns and work. Ibrahim, welcome to Davigist. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Sam. Happy to be here.
Thank you. I suppose the first question for me is looking at your career progression. And I realized that at some points you've been in finance, you've been in products, and now you're in education. What did your earliest career ambition look like?
It's a great question, Sam. So I have to provide a bit of context because it's important to contextualize the answer. So I'm obviously a person of color, and I am South African, and grew up in South Africa during the dark days of apartheid. And during that time, opportunities for people who look like me were extremely limited. I mean, we all know the history, so I won't dwell on that too much. But I'm the youngest of five, and for all of my siblings, their opportunities for tertiary study and just for career opportunities were extremely limited. I got lucky, and it's purely based on my age, no other reason. Because when I finished high school, it was the time when South Africa was transforming. Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and the country became a democracy. So purely by chance, I was provided with opportunities or afforded opportunities my siblings just simply did not have. And so I got lucky. I was the first in my family to go to university. And education has changed my life, like fundamentally altered the shape of my life. But coming back to your question, growing up, it was extremely difficult because there weren't many role models in a corporate environment or even from an entrepreneurial perspective. And so for some reason, I latched onto a family member who happened to be working for a local bank, and he was the local branch manager. And I just looked up to him because here was somebody who seemed to be making a difference in the community, helping community members with finance. And so banking was probably my earliest ambition. And thinking back, I should have dreamt a lot bigger. But anyway, we'll get back to that in a second. But I also am a firm believer in manifestation. I'll tell you an interesting story. I was probably about 12 or 13 years old, driving with my dad, and we drove past this beautiful big white building on stilts in Johannesburg, in Auckland Park, right on the hill. And I said to my dad, I'm going to be the CEO of that company one day. And of course he smiled and he was encouraging. And sort of fast forward 20 years later, I was CEO of Diners Club, which was still in that building 20 years later. So just a little bit of an anecdote. It's amazing how you are able to manifest dreams if you put your mind to things. But Diners Club is also a financial services company. So anyway, my earliest ambition was always to be in banking, finance. I was in finance for about 15 years. To your introduction in a variety of different roles, business development, product management, ultimately general management, leading a couple of companies focused on the African continent. But if you fast forward to like 10 years ago, I was really struggling because if you consider my background, the importance of education, and how that shaped my life, I was starting to question whether banking was really good for my soul and whether it was something meaningful enough for me. And so I approached a headhunter friend of mine about 10 years ago, and I said to him, I want out of banking. I want to do something a little bit more purposeful, more meaningful with my life. And we looked at a bunch of different industries. Education wasn't top of the list, but is there work I can do in a charity or in some kind of philanthropic entity? Education was on the list, but not, as I said, certainly not top of the list. And life and the universe is a funny way of giving you what you need. Purely by coincidence, not through the headhunter friend, Pearson found my profile. It's actually a really funny story. I don't often tell it, but I'll tell it to students because they might laugh. I think they will find it funny. I was featured in the South African GQ magazine. It was a business feature, not because of my dress sense. And Pearson stumbled upon this profile, somebody within Pearson, their talent acquisition team, and they thought, it was an interesting profile, and they were looking for a new CEO for their South Africa business, and they actually approached me. I'd never heard of Pearson, but the more I was talking to them, the more I liked what I heard, and education had such a strong resonance with me, given the importance it had had in shaping my life, that I jumped at the opportunity. And so I transitioned from banking to education 10 years ago. It's been the best decision of my life. I'm a lot poorer for it. I mean, banking pays a lot better than education. But this is not the point. The point is, I think as you think about your career path, you need to, and this is a process, like it doesn't happen immediately, it happens eventually, but you need to find something that has purpose, that has meaning to you, that is authentic to who you are. That will make the journey just that much more pleasant.
Ebrahim, let's talk about luck, because I see this play out at different phases of the journey, and also interestingly, because you mentioned the word. And it dawned on me that in two scenarios now, I've seen luck playing out in the stories you just ran through now. The first scenario for me would be you being the last of 5 children and how you were fortunate to be educated. And of course, the other bit would be your transition from Diners Club to Pearson, based off, I would say, pure coincidence, because I would imagine there were so many people that Pearson could have reached out to, and they just picked you. What do you think about luck? Do you think it just finds people, or it meets preparation?
I mean, I use the word luck, and there's definitely an element of timing in things, right? And I've seen that in corporate. Oftentimes people progress purely based on timing. You're riding the wave of good timing. But, so there is an element of luck. But at the same time, you do make your own luck. Gary Player once said to me, the sort of famous South African golfer, I'm pretty sure your students don't know who he is, but he's one of the greatest all-time golfers ever. South African guy. And I've been fortunate enough to play a couple of rounds of golf with Gary Player during my banking days. This doesn't happen in the world of education. And he once said to me, the more I practice, the luckier I get. And I think it's a famous quote of his because I think he uses it a lot. But that has stuck with me because, yes, luck has got a lot to do with these things, but you also make your own luck and you have to seize these opportunities. And it's not like I was the only candidate Pearson considered, right? So there's still an interview process. You're still competing with others. So the doors might be open based on a little bit of serendipity, but you have to be able to walk through it with confidence. And ultimately, there still is an element of you having to work for it. So it's not like these things have just landed in my lap. Of course, you have to do the work. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's a bit of a combination of luck and timing, but also hard work.
Yeah, I mean, I love your explanation around that, how that you can make your own luck. I think that really resonated with me, and again, it's a reminder that even though there could be some elements of luck, but then there's always the place of preparation, and then for me, it again interrogates the very idea of luck, because I would imagine, and I know a lot of people, maybe a lot of students also, the mere mention of luck, he means, or it sounds like something you perhaps merited, or something that just falls on your lap without doing anything. But again, I love your explanation around you making your own luck. In other words, you getting yourself in the headspace, in the frame of mind where luck actually meets you prepared. Otherwise, it's just it just goes.
Yeah, no, you make a great point, and I don't want to sit here and have students believe that you need luck in order to succeed. I think that's part of it. But hard work, discipline is equally a critical part of it. And the last thing I will say on this point is like making friends along the way.
Yeah.
Super important.
I mean, before you go to Diners Club, what was it like in banking?
Um, so just to continue the topic of like you have to work hard.
Yeah.
Students should be under no illusion that I've gotten to where I am because of hard work. Like there's a big component of effort. And just to get back to your question, I started out my career in banking working for a South African bank, one of the big 5 banks in South Africa called Nedbank. And because I had studied commercial law, I ended up in their legal department, but it was of the electronic banking division. Now that all sounds nice, but the job basically back in the day entailed me comparing signatures on a written instruction to a signature that we had on file for the authorized signatories of that company, right? So I was literally looking at a signature on a piece of paper, looking at the signature on our system to make sure that they were the same, stamped this bloody piece of paper and signed it, right? So I vetted it, and then it goes to some other really important guy who actually then captures this piece of paper to an electronic database. And so I served my tour of duty, Sam. Like I was in the trenches. And what I didn't tell you is like my first year out of university, I worked for MultiChoice, which was like an African broadcaster, television broadcaster, pay for TV. And I worked in their video library division. My job was I was given a couple of channels, and I was given a piece of paper every day, and I had to go and find these cassettes, like Beta Max cassettes on shelves that would be aired the following day. And I'd put them on a trolley, and I'd wheel it to a control center for some other, again, super important guy to take them out of the covers and actually put it into the machine and press play. Like that guy was really important. My job was just to find these things, put them on a trolley and wheel them, and then go and collect them at the end of the day. I did that for a year. And again, South Africa had a youth unemployment rate back then of about 32%. And so jobs were hard to come by, much like they are today for graduating students. Yeah. But much worse than, let's say, any market other than South Africa. I think it's worsened in South Africa now to between 50 and 60%. But it was really tough, right? So you took what you could get. And given my background, there's a hunger to succeed and to provide for, support my family, etc. So I grabbed this job and did it for a year whilst looking for a transition into banking, which was always the ambition. And so this role at Nedbank was actually a godsend for me. It was my entree into banking. And I did that comparing of signatures, stamping of these files for a good 6 months, but worked my butt off. And that's super important because I think early in your career, one of the things you want to do is provide really clear signals to leadership that you are somebody who can be trusted, no matter the job. And you are somebody who, when they entrust something to you, it gets done. And I was good at that. I've always been good at that, still am. And somebody spotted something in me, and I was promoted about 6 months later to supervise this team. So now, instead of me comparing signatures or watching others do it, and of course I was still doing work, I would say that a little bit facetiously. But I had to start somewhere. And then my career progressed. So beyond that, I then got into project management within the banking environment, still in that electronic banking division. And what my role was looking at how we apply electronic banking solutions to the bank's back office to reduce costs. I did that for about a year. And then the bank asked me to join its card payments division. And that was because Nedbank had landed a big deal with Swisscard, which is a Swiss banking entity. And a lot of our team members were shipped off to Switzerland to manage this joint venture. And so there were gaps in our payments business. And I was offered a couple of roles. So one was a process management role, and the other was an operations management role. Now, process management was quite sexy at the time. It was, back in the days of Black Belt and Six Sigma, and this was the place to be. But I had a leader at the time who said to me, "You've done a good job so far early on in your career. The one thing you need to get to is stretch yourself from a people management perspective," which brings me to my second point. I spoke about range, or not range so much, sorry. I spoke about the fact that you need to build trust.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is range is important early on in your career because you're not really sure what it is you want to do, what you're good at, what appeals. So expose yourself to as much as you possibly can early on in your career. And he said to me, the one thing you need more of is people management. And so when these two options were presented to me, as I said, one really attractive and super important at the time, process management, the other operations management, much less sexy. But I asked the question, how big is the team here? And they said, well, you'd be an individual contributor. You'd be working on your own in process management. But this operations management role, you're actually going to look after dispute management for the card division. There's 300 people, ultimately is the size of the team. I said, well, that's the role I'm taking. Even though, it wasn't necessarily the role that appealed the most, it was the one that would stretch me and made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. And so that's the other message around range. Choose things that takes you out of your comfort zone because that's where growth happens. And while, Sam, I'm going to be honest with your students and with you, it was probably the worst year of my career. I did not enjoy it because it was the year I was about 25 years of age managing 300 people. Now, not directly, I had a structure, but boy, oh boy, dealing with people issues, mid-20s, is an extremely challenging thing. But looking back, while I didn't enjoy it, it was extremely formative and did a fantastic job helping me to be the leader I am today. Right? So I learned so much in that 12 months. And again, around the point of timing and opportunity, that role introduced me to the folks at MasterCard, which is the global credit card company. And they liked what they saw in me, and they approached me, even though I was a customer, right? So they were engaging with Nedbank as a customer of MasterCard. But they, off the back of some engagements we had, liked what they saw and approached me and offered me a role in business development, completely different from operations. And again, I grabbed it with two hands, exposure to international company, global markets. And that's when my career became really interesting because I was then looking at developing the MasterCard business across the African continent. I was looking at key account management, looking after some really big banks in Africa, ABSA, Standard Bank was one of my later employers, Standard Chartered, Barclays, some really big multinationals, and exposed to some really cool contra revenue type deals and how you build good account management capabilities and establish the brand of MasterCard on the continent. And so, started out in the trenches, serving my tour of duty, but that got me on a path to much bigger and better. And I'll keep this last bit really, really short. Post MasterCard, I got introduced to Standard Bank. They then employed me as MD of their joint venture businesses initially. It was really exciting. I was then promoted to look after their Bluebeam division, which was at the height of the dot-com boom, was looking at the intersection of mobile banking and financial services. And that was really, really cool. Also challenging because MD of the Bluebeam division, which is all about lending, at the height of the financial crisis. So that was a really, really tough time. But then, I got through that and the bank liked, again, what it is I did. Diners Club happens to be a wholly owned subsidiary of Standard Bank. So they asked me to take the helm of Diners Club off the back of my performances in prior roles. And I stayed at Diners Club for 6 years. It was supposed to be a short-term gig. It was a turnaround gig. And by the way, you mentioned turnarounds. I've always been big on turnarounds. The Bluebeam division was in trouble. It was a business that was losing money when I assumed control. Fast forward 3 years later, and it was generating somewhere around 200 to 300 million rand of net profit annually, right? So turned that business around, turned around the joint venture businesses. It was also loss-making, was super profitable by the time I handed it off. Diners Club was a declining business. And sort of 3 years into my stint, we had recruited so many new customers that we actually ran out of space in our mainframe. It's silly to even say that, but it happened. But I enjoyed it so much that I stayed for 6 years, even though the intention was go and turn this thing around, come back into the bank. I loved it because it was an independent, sort of self-sustaining business outside of the bank. I had control of an end-to-end P&L. So I control the entire value chain, everything reporting to me, sales, marketing, product, engineering, etc. That was so cool for my development and again took me out of my comfort zone. So I stayed for 6 years and then that led me to education, which is where I am today.
What I can see from all of the story is devotion to your craft. And I think it's just super important to stress that whatever students find doing, at least to start with, really doing it very well. And from the conversations I've had in previous podcasts, one of the things one of the guests said was even the part-time roles the student now take on now, that it's a great start point to develop some certain skills and build themselves and just be intentional about growth even from now, and not necessarily wait until they have the dream job, just start somewhere. I think another thing that really resonated with me, which again is one of the things I was going to have conversation with you, is about leadership. I'm really keen to see some of the amazing things you say about leadership. But before then, I really just want to take you a step back around how you eventually became the CEO of Diners Club and the story with your dad, when you told your dad you were going to become the CEO of Diners Club. And there's this thing about personal declaration and vision board there. At the time when you mentioned that to your dad and when you eventually became the CEO of Diners Club, did you intentionally walk towards it? Was it intentional, or was it nature or the world bringing it to you because you've said it at some point?
I think it's a bit of both, Sam. And I know some people think that I'm smoking my socks, but I don't think you can underestimate the power of dreaming really, really big. I like your point around vision boards. I'm a firm believer in creating super graphic and vivid imagery in your brain about where it is you see yourself and where you want to be. I know it's going to sound a little bit esoteric and far-fetched, but I do believe in manifestation. I do believe in it wholeheartedly. It's played such a crucial part in my life. So I believe in a higher power. And I believe that one can tap into that higher power. Firmly believe that. But at the same time, you have to walk towards things. And it's back to the earlier conversation, the Gary Player comment about, the more I practice, the luckier I get.
Yeah.
Of course, you have to match that with preparation, putting in time, putting in effort. Especially in today's environment with technology advancing so quickly, the half-life of skills is shrinking massively, right? So what you know today might be completely irrelevant tomorrow, just given how fast things are changing. And so that point around constantly investing in yourself, constantly learning, cannot be underestimated. And learning to learn is the new superpower. And so for students today, the one thing you have to understand, you have to be fully prepared to be a beginner over and over and over again, right? Because things are just changing so quickly. And so that willingness to learn and learning to learn is quite an important skill. And we all have slightly different ways and styles of how we learn. Make sure you zone into what works for you and you sharpen it, because it's going to stand you in good stead. It's such an important skill. The other point I will make around how you kind of set yourself up for the future in such an uncertain world. The one thing that is enduring in this world of fast-paced technology is whether you want to call it soft skills or power skills or 21st century skills, doesn't matter what you call them. I don't like the word soft because I don't think they're soft. I think they're so darn important. But, judgment, critical thinking, decision-making, creativity, teamwork, collaboration, these things are so bloody important. You cannot underestimate how important they are. Today, when I look for folks who I want to hire, that sort of attitude, that willingness to learn, that curiosity is super important. But the other thing I look for are all of these soft skills, or power skills as I like to call them. You try and look for those things. Those are super important. I hire for that. The technical stuff's important, but technical stuff can be learned, relearned, etc., and it's changing. So I would say focus on learning to learn as a core skill, focus on power skills. Super important.
This is very interesting for me, Ebrahim, because Ruth said the same thing and she used the same phrase, learn to learn. That's the same thing she mentioned on the last episode, and it's so interesting to see you mentioning the same thing. I think another thing I'm picking up from you is the choice of words, soft skills. I think I will agree with you. Power skill, really good, looks good. And again, this will just take me straight to leadership. And I think some of the traits you just mentioned are some of the amazing qualities that a leader would need, especially in the age and time. And we talked about in the previous episodes, we've talked about traits like, just like you mentioned, communication, decision making, presentation skills, and a whole lot. Personally, on this role, I've had to pick a whole lot of things and challenge myself, just to be as much as possible, build or get those necessary traits that would really help me on the roles. There was a time when what I used to do was I would challenge myself to just meet 5 random people and just say hello. And there are times I get very beautiful feedback and very responsive, and there are times I get the look, can you just mind your business? But then I really just knew what I wanted to get, and I knew what I was intentional about building. Going to leadership, as a leader, what traits do you think is the most important?
Oh, another fantastic question. For me,
Yeah, maybe that may be a good place to start. What trait has really helped you the most?
humility is extremely important. And I'll tell you why I say that. When I was younger, I was quite cocky, I was arrogant. One might say even narcissistic, possibly, extremely self-centered. That's a recipe for disaster in leadership. Um, I think humility is so important, to be humble. Um, that's an important principle for me. The other, and I suppose it's tied to humility, is empathy. Always try to put yourself in the shoes of others. Um, and there's a reason these things are important, because in life and in your career, you deliver with and through people, through others. And in order to motivate and inspire teams, I think both of those qualities are super important. You have to be humble, you have to be empathetic. And I'd say perhaps slightly away from the softer things, it's extremely important to be crisp and simplistic in terms of strategy and vision. I've often found that in leadership, or in certain leaders, over-engineer on trying to tell the strategy of, an entity, a company, a division, whatever. So I'm a firm believer in keeping it simple. Like, it needs to be really easy to articulate and easy for folks to understand. So I guess there's a message in there around simplicity and communication. And then the last thing I would say, tying it all together, is storytelling has, for me, I'm not saying I'm a great storyteller, and your students probably think this guy can't tell stories, but I think storytelling is just so important. It's such an important skill to learn, because it's through storytelling that you bring things to life for others, and you get them to rally around an idea.
Humility, simplicity, and communication, and storytelling.
Yeah.
Being humble and being able to take the lead at times. Do you think there could be a contrast?
I don't think so. So when one's humble, that doesn't mean that you're not confident.
Yeah,
that
confidence.
you're not.
That's the word for me. Yeah.
It doesn't take away from confidence or putting yourself forward for difficult tasks. Those things are different. I mean, the way I would describe humility in that scenario is you understand, again, take that particular example, that you don't have all of the answers as you put yourself forward for these things. You embrace the discomfort, and you're open to asking for help and open to acknowledging when you've made a mistake, open to feedback, criticism, and you embrace these things as areas for opportunities for development, rather. So I don't see them as conflicting. I see them as complementary, if anything.
Yeah. So I think that's very brilliant. Thank you. The other question I have around leadership would be, I know another key component of a leader is the decision-making aspect of things. And I know as leaders, and as someone who's been in this role and who's been fortunate to make one decision or the other, I think, again, being on the governing council with you, I think one of the scariest moments for me is whenever we have to approve. And because I just think about, I mean, I know in the next 5, 10 years, 20 years time, there could be need to revisit some of those approvers and look at those who approved, who approved them. Again, all we're doing is for the future. So that really terrifies me. If I'm actually making the right decision with accepting to approve this, because I know at the end of the day, my name is penned down as part of those who approve this. So what do you think are the most important elements to look out for as a leader whilst making decision?
So I'll tell you my approach. And of course, the context is important and the type of decision you're making is important, but I'm super decisive. I always have been. And that stood me in good stead. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Oftentimes, I have to make decisions with incomplete information. Um, and it's true that given just the situation in the world, that there's a ton of ambiguity. And the last thing you need is indecision. Like, it's important to have leaders who are decisive and who are prepared to make a call one way or the other. And the reason I think that's important is you have to understand that there are generally two types of decisions. And if you imagine them as, there are two doors. There are some decisions where you walk through that door, you can walk back, right? So, and I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't consider the stakes, but I am saying sometimes it's okay if you've made the wrong call because you can reverse that decision. There are other decisions where once you walk through that door, it's not a revolving door, you ain't going back. And I would say that it's important to make the distinction between those two, because the latter requires a lot more discipline, requires a little bit more certainty, requires a lot more engagement and consultation. And so make sure that you're surrounding yourself with folks who ultimately know more than you about these things, that you listen, and that you are prepared to change your mind. Because that's the other thing I've seen is, in a lot of leaders, once they've made up their mind, they find it very, very difficult to change their minds. I try to be a listener, and I try to be as flexible as possible. And again, back to that humility point, I admit when I'm wrong, and I'm open to being convinced of a different point of view. And then the last thing I will say on decision-making in a leadership environment, especially, you refer to the board. It's a big group, and getting to consensus sometimes, not always. I think the board is maybe not the best example, because I think the board members often do align on things. But I've been in environments where everybody doesn't agree. But the last thing you need is inertia and not making a decision, because inaction is like the worst possible thing. It's this whole concept of disagree and commit. Right? So if there's a majority of folks who believe in a decision, there are a couple of dissenting voices. It's important that as a leadership group, while you might disagree, once you've made that decision and the majority rules, you all commit to the damn decision. Right? So don't second guess it. Don't say afterwards, hey, I didn't agree with this. Make sure that you're all rallying around that decision, because that gives it the best chance of success. No, I said inaction is sometimes bad, but doing nothing is also a decision.
Yeah.
Right? But I would just say, put yourself out there. Make decisions, like be decisive. It's, I think, quite an important leadership trait.
Thinking my situation, looking at myself, many times when I try to make decisions, personal decisions now, I take longer. And I take longer so much that I end up most times or many times not making a decision. Because I consider the pros and cons of each, and it feels like at the end of the day there's a pro and con for either option, and gets me at the end of the day either making the decisions very late or end up not making the decision at all. From what you just said, I think what I'm learning is to first of all consider the end goal or the repercussion of the decision. If it's a decision where I can come back, can retrace my path to where I started from, maybe I can be a little quicker. But then if I may not be able to retrace my path, maybe I might take longer. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Spot on.
Good, thank you. I think that's going to be very helpful, because I think forever sometimes to make a decision, and it's always the fear of what happens if something goes wrong for me. The next bit for me, which is the last bit before I go to the closing part of the conversation, is higher education and skills and the future. And I think it's important that you made mention to some amazing things I was going to ask around this. And I think the most interesting bit I really want to mention here is around artificial intelligence and the future of higher
Yeah.
education. And it's interesting that you made reference to some of the power skills that you think are really very important in the very present age and time. Also important to hear you talk about the employment process for you and how you're really keen about graduates having more of those power skills than the technical details or the technical knowledge from the university. Again, because according to you, it's important and experience for students to now learn how to learn. In the present age and time, what do you think is the future of higher education?
Sam, it's an extremely difficult question. I think it's fair to say that globally, the higher education just industry is under enormous pressure. I don't think it's a secret that increasingly, there are questions being asked about the value of a degree, and the role of universities and of higher education in the ecosystem. I have a very strong point of view. I think universities are so important, and they are extremely important for a number of reasons, in my opinion. I don't know about you, but where I went to school, I wasn't really challenged to think critically. I wasn't really exposed to as many different cultures and folks from different, backgrounds. And that's sort of, and there are a couple of components that made university life so important to me. Number one was a little bit around independence. Number two was the social element and getting to know people from different backgrounds, different markets, and understanding that life was not just this little suburb I grew up in Johannesburg. But I would say last but most important was this whole concept of critical thinking. My time at university and the lecturers I was exposed to, they all challenged me to question things and to think about the world differently. And that has been a skill or an ability that has stood me in such good stead in my career. And I would argue that without university, I don't have to argue. I know for a fact I would not be sitting here talking to you today. My life would have been vastly different. And so there are just such important elements beyond, what folks often focus on that a degree and university gives you. It also still remains the most, I would argue, important signal to employers about what you're capable of. And when I look at the University of Derby as an example, it's doing such an amazing job linking to employability and to jobs and careers, and the tie-up with Rolls-Royce is super exciting. I see Derby doing such a phenomenal job tying to like real-world outcomes. And so I think, for those students studying here, I think you've chosen really, really well. I'm super proud to be, somehow a small part of this university. But having said that, AI, you mentioned artificial intelligence. It's like reshaping the way people learn, like fundamentally, right? We all know for a fact that students are all using AI. Right? We're all using these LLMs, whether it's Anthropic or ChatGPT or whatever it is you're using. And oftentimes using that to supplant like the learning resources provided by universities, right? So my day job is I work with universities across the globe, right? So my remit is international higher education for Pearson. So that's pretty much all countries outside of the US. So we provide learning resources to universities in something like 160 countries across the globe. And challenges that the UK faces and Derby faces is not unique. Like, this is happening all over the world. It's a global phenomenon. And AI can be both good, but it can also be quite bad. So my advice to students in this case is absolutely use the technology, by all means. But please make sure that you're looking at the outputs critically, because AI still hallucinates. It doesn't always get things right. And so you need to make sure that, again, it's back to that judgment, critical thinking, but you need to make sure that you are constantly evaluating these things and make sure that you're using it ethically, right? So make sure that you're learning. Do not use it just to get to answers, because then you're not learning. You're not doing yourself any favors. Absolutely use the technology, but use it appropriately. And then for universities, a couple of things. I think increasingly universities have to embrace that students are actively using this technology. And instead of, I'm not saying Derby's doing this, but like I see it sometimes globally, instead of denying that fact, embrace it and make sure that you are creating the conditions for students to actually use it effectively and while they're still learning. And that requires you to adapt your teaching framework. It requires you to adapt your assessment framework, so how you assess whether students have learned, and making sure that your assessments are AI resilient, right? So that it cannot be gamed, because you would be doing the students and parents and the community a disservice if you allowed that to happen. So my overarching message is, I think universities, despite the challenges today, have an extremely important role to play and will continue to do so. I do think, though, it's important that they transform and that they acknowledge that this is an important inflection point, not just for universities, but for education in general. And number three, on the point of AI, embrace it and make sure that you are adapting to enable your students to actually be ethical users of AI, and that learning continues to happen.
One of the things I've discovered from students and from conversation with students is there are two categories of students. On the one hand, students who are very skeptical that once they use AI, they're going to feel they're going to be judged. And on the other side of the spectrum, a student will go overboard in how they use it for the assessments. But again, the question is, how do we meet at the center and reach a middle ground on the right use of AI? And it's interesting to see that a lot of work has been going on there. I think another interesting thing I've seen over the course of the month is lecturers and academics really exploring other ways of gauging students' knowledge. So areas like presentations are now more common. Group work are now more common rather than just doing the assessment and just turning it in and just grading. So they want to hear from the student and have these conversations, and I think that's really, really very important. Again, going back to the power skills, the ability for students to be able to communicate their ideas, because I personally think the next generation of board leaders and managers and CEOs will be those who can communicate their ideas, who can communicate their learnings and not just have the knowledge. So,
like, one last thing on AI.
Yeah.
All of the research that I've seen points to one very important factor around AI. The power of AI can only be unlocked through human skills. Like, people have to know how to use the technology, and they have to know how to apply the technology in order to unlock real value. Like, the tech on its own is not good enough. Like, if you really want to unlock true value, employers globally have to upskill their workforce. And so I guess it's back to the message to the student community is absolutely embrace the tech. Learn as much as you possibly can, but don't just use it. Learn how it works. If you are studying, let's say, marketing, think about how it can be applied as a marketeer when you have a job. Whether it's around data analytics or campaign evaluation or generation, whatever. Um, think about AI in the context of the career you're potentially pursuing as well, right? So AI is important, but I think the importance of like human skills to complement that is more important.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. One final question. None. Is there anything you think we haven't discussed yet that you really want to
Um,
mention?
I think, yeah, I mean, just back to the question you asked about the future of higher education. The last thing I will say is the relationships and the friendships I made at university continue to this day. Um, and that also cannot be underestimated. You know, I spoke a little bit, I mentioned make friends earlier and its importance in your career. That's so important because the people you meet here, these are the future sort of leaders in the UK, but also globally. There's a strong international community here. And again, that cannot be underestimated. So make friends, like use this and make sure you stay in touch. Because I spoke a bit about credibility and trust and your reputation. And by the way, you know, that's something that builds over time, and you cannot underestimate how trust, that quotient just builds and builds over time. But your reputation ultimately defines how people talk about you when you're not in the room. But it's relationships that gets you pulled into opportunities, right? So I don't want to use the word networking, it's overused.
Yeah.
But I'm instead talking about the friendships you develop, the relationships you develop. Make sure you maintain them and you invest in them throughout your career.
And I think that's really very expedient, especially because I think one of the things that social media has done to the current generation of students is we're so engrossed with our mobile so much that we are really failing in really building some of those meaningful relationships that folks in the earlier generations were really conscious of. I mean, a lot of students we just talk on our mobile and we think the world ends there. But I'm also a firm believer that the next generation of CEOs and managers will be those who really utilize the power of relationship and conscious about building such. Thank you very much. The last segment is the pass and the torch.
Yeah.
And I have a question from Ruth for you.
Yeah.
So she says, rather than the 16 or 18-year-old self, can you think about your 25-year-old self? When life is beginning to happen, what message would you leave to them? And it's actually interesting for me because you did make mention of 25 years when you said when you begin the leadership at the bank, leading about 300 people, like you said earlier.
Yeah.
And it's just really interesting to see you spot on.
Yeah, so I'll try and keep it brief. I would say that life is, and one's career is a marathon, not a sprint. You may not have the answers up front, but that's okay. As I said, focus on range, so get exposure to as many things as you possibly can, and focus on authenticity and what has meaning to you. And again, that's something you will discover as you explore different things. But if you get that authenticity, that meaning right, it will just make your journey that much more enjoyable. Right? So yes, success is important, and how you define success is important. It could be a financial metric, but for me, what I hope I described is how my priorities changed from initially a lot around success is defined by my title and how much money I was making, to increasingly purpose and whether I was having a meaningful impact on society. Right? So, and that doesn't mean that that's important to everybody. All I'm saying is define what is meaningful to you as quickly as you possibly can and try and get to that. Now, It might take many, many years, but it's fine because, as I said, this is a journey, right? Um, but focusing on that meaning in your career will help you so, so much. So that's, I guess, the key insight for me. And I hope that I've sort of conveyed it through telling my story.
Yeah. I think there's one more thing I really want, really keen on hearing about this. If you can think back at 25, what was going on in your mind?
Yeah, it's shoot. I don't want to take students into my 25-year-old mind because, yeah, I was very power hungry at the time. Right, I was very focused on money. I was very focused on my title, and I had defined success using those two metrics, almost in isolation of everything else. And in my mind, success equaled promotion, getting ahead, and more money. So that's what I've been trying to convey. Extremely self-centered, extremely individualistic, and not the nicest person on planet Earth.
Well, all of those changed.
Yeah, I'm happy to say. The love of a good woman is super important.
Okay.
I got married early. I met my wife when I was in my mid-20s. We got married when I was 27, a week before my 28th birthday. Or no, a few months before my 28th birthday. And she has been such a influential force in me getting rid of a lot of those narcissistic tendencies. I'm a much better person today because of her. Yeah. So yeah, fast forward to where I'm not going to give away my age, but I'm very old. I'm happy to say that I've worked through a lot of those things. But my advice which is why I talk a lot about humility. My advice to students would be, don't be me at age 25.
So thank you. The final bit is where you drop the question for the next person.
So this is the one area where you prepped me. So the other questions,
Yeah.
I was unprepared. But this one, I've got. So here's what I'd like the next interviewee to answer. What belief did you hold early in your career that turned out to be wrong? And how did changing that belief shape who you've become?
Overall, thank you very much, Ebrahim. Thank you for your time and thank you for the knowledge and for being very vulnerable. And it's really great to have this conversation with you. So, thank you very much for being with us and for listening to this episode of Daviji's Conversation with Ebrahim Matthews. So, I'll see you on the next one. Thank you.